Okay, this week's address, Parshas Mishpatim, first pasuk, Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lefneihem. These are the ordinances that you shall place before them. So Rashi says, the first Rashi, Ve'ela Mishpatim, kol makom shenemar eila, wherever it says these, it comes to exclude or to make null and void that which was mentioned beforehand. But it says ve'ela, but it says and these, the conjunction of the vav. So Mosif al Harishonim, it comes to add to the first ones. Maharishonim misinai, just as the first ones, last week Sedra in Parshas Yisro, the Ten Commandments were mentioned, which were given at Sinai, af elu misinai. So these laws are also from Sinai. Nismecha v'lama nismecha parshas dinim leparshas u'mizbeach. And why is it that the laws, Parshas Mishpatim, to a large degree deals with civil laws? And so why is it that the Parsha, the portion of the Torah that deals with civil laws, is mentioned near the Parsha of the Mizbeach, near the Parsha that deals with how the Mizbeach, the altar, was to be constructed? So at the end of Parshas Yisro, Lomar Lecha, Shetasim Sanhedrin Eitz Lahem Mizbeach, in order to tell you that the Sanhedrin should sit near the altar. Now, there are a number of questions. So in other words, the Sanhedrin, that was the High Court of Israel, they sat in the Beis Hamikdash in the temple near the altar. There is another text, really the same thing, but the other text that say Eitz Hamikdash. They sat by the Mikdash, by the temple, meaning in the temple. Now, we have to understand, first of all, to the degree that we can, of course, it's a law, but there is a hashkafa behind the law. We have to understand, why is it that there was a requirement that the Sanhedrin should sit in the temple? That's the first question. The second question is, there seems to be 2 or 3 parts to this Rashi. The first part is to tell me the connection between Parshas Yisro and Eila Mishpatim, that Parshas Mishpatim, which deals primarily with civil law, with the adjudication of civil law, is mentioned. It was mentioned at Sinai also, and then it goes, and then Rashi says, why is it mentioned near the law of the altar, or in order to tell you that the Sanhedrin, that the Beis Din Hagadol, the High Court of Israel, had to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. Now, so these 2 parts of Rashi, there must be a relationship. Otherwise, Rashi would have made them into 2 separate, not treated them as one thing in the same Rashi. Then we also have to know, because if you take a look in Parshas Shoftim, the Torah there already tells us that the High Court of Israel had to sit in the temple. The Torah tells us there, that's Perek Yud Zayin, Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Hey, Pasuk Ches, I'm sorry, Ki yipolei mimcha davar lamishpat, if a matter of judgment is hidden from you, bein dam ledam, between blood and blood, bein din ledin, between verdict and verdict, ubein nega leneged, divrei rivos b'sharecha, matters of dispute, among the cities. You shall get up and go to the chosen place that God chooses, and that was the court of Israel. So we have a pasuk already in Shoftim that indicates that the Sanhedrin sat in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. So why was it necessary for the juxtaposition between Mishpatim and Yisro, which concludes with the building? Yisro concludes with the building of the Mizbeach, of the altar, in order to tell us that the Sanhedrin has to sit, that the High Court of Israel, the Beis Din, the authority of Jewish law, has to sit in the temple. We already know it from Parshas Mishpatim. And another question, it's a similar, we take a look at the different topics that are mentioned one next to the other and over sometimes. We have the halachas of the Mishpatim, this week's Sedra, the civil law, the Mizbeach, the altar, which was already mentioned, laws about the Mishkan, the whole next half of Chumash Mos deals about the construction of the tabernacle, which was the temple that the Jewish people carried throughout their journey in the desert, and even for many years once they entered Eretz Yisrael, until the temple was finally built. And also the Egel, the building of the golden calf by the Jewish people. So all of these things are mentioned together. And the question is, there must be some connection between them. Now, the Ramban, it's a very, very interesting Ramban. The Ramban is actually in two places. It's in his Hagdama to Chumash Mos, as well as in the Parshas Truma. The Ramban had the theory that each of the 5 Chumashim had a special theme. And the theme of Chumash Mos was Yetzias Mitzrayim, was the Exodus. But he was troubled. The second half of Chumash Mos, that deals with the construction of the Mishkan. It deals with the construction and the setting up of the tabernacle. That seems to be, of course, everything in the Torah is related, but it does not seem to be directly related to the Exodus. It would seem, the Ramban doesn't say this explicitly, but I'm sure that's what he meant, that the construction of the Mishkan would probably have been more appropriate for Chumash Vayikra. Why is it included in Chumash Mos, whose theme is the Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the Exodus? It's true, Chumash Mos discusses Matan Torah, but Matan Torah, to a large degree, Matan Torah represents, is the culmination of Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the culmination of the Exodus from Egypt. But why is the Mishkan mentioned? And the Ramban says that the reason Chumash Mos, the second half of Chumash Mos, deals with the Mishkan is because it was the purpose of the Mishkan, the purpose of the tabernacle, to take the sanctity of Mount Sinai and bring it to Jerusalem. It was transferred by the Jewish people taking the tabernacle, there was a transference of the sanctity of Mount Sinai that in a sense was delivered to Jerusalem, where it became a permanent part of the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, so in a certain sense, we could say that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, was to serve, according to the Ramban, as the perpetuation or the continuation of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah. Now, the question is, what was the essence of Kedushas Hamikdash? What was the essence of the sanctity of the temple and the sanctity, to a certain degree, of Jerusalem? And what was the essence of the sanctity of Har Sinai, of Mount Sinai? And I've mentioned many times in the Haggadah we say, Ilu kervanu, in the Dayenus, we say, Ilu kervanu lifnei Har Sinai, v'lo nosan lanu es Torah Dayenu. If God had brought us close to Mount Sinai and didn't give us the Torah, that in itself would have been very great. And the question is asked by many, what do you mean? What would have been the purpose of coming to Mount Sinai and not getting the Torah? All kinds of answers are given. There are those who say because at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people were ki'ish echad b'leiv echad. They were like one person with one heart. But I think the simple answer is Kirvanu L'fnei Har Sinai doesn't mean that God brought us close to Mount Sinai. But what it means is, and I've mentioned this before, Kirvanu L'fnei Har Sinai is that God brought us close to himself. In other words, at Mount Sinai, there was revelation. We sense the presence of God to a much greater degree than the Jewish people did at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf. So, Ilu Kervanu L'fnei Har Sinai, if God had brought us close to himself, and I mentioned last week, God is everywhere. But not everywhere do we have that same ability to sense his presence. So at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people sensed the presence of God to a greater degree. And because of that, that's Kervanu L'fnei Har Sinai. So that in itself, even if the Torah hadn't been given to us, that would have been a great experience. So that's why we say Ilu Kervanu L'fnei Har Sinai. Now, it's interesting. I discussed last week the reading of the Aseret Dibros, and I mentioned that the Gemara in Brachas mentions that there was an attempt to include or to recite the Aseret Dibros in the tefillos and the prayers together with the Kriya Shema, either as part of the Kriya Shema or together with the Kriya Shema. And it was not done because of the Minim. The Minim were a group of Jews who were, it was considered a heretical group, and they certainly did not believe in the oral tradition. But even in the Torah Shebechsav, even in the written law, they gave special significance to the Aseres Adibros, to the Ten Commandments, to the degree that the rest of the Torah became less significant. And in order to not give them the ability to use the recitation of the Aseres Adibros as proof for their philosophy, the Chachamim did not include the recitation of the Aseres Adibros together with the Shema. And it's interesting, but there was one exception to that. And the exception was in the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, the Jewish people, the Kriya Shema was recited in the Beis HaMikdash together with the Shema. Apparently, there was more reason to recite the Aseres Hadibros in the Beis HaMikdash than anywhere else. I think I saw, perhaps in the Marsha, I don't remember where I saw it, but I saw that the reason they recited in the Beis HaMikdash was because the Minim would not have been able, they did not have to worry. The Chachamim did not have to worry. The sages did not have to worry about the recitation of the Aseres Adibros in the Beis HaMikdash. It was just one place. But had it been throughout the different Jewish communities, wherever there was the fear that the Minim would be able to use that to gather people to support their philosophy. Okay, but it seems to me that even if those had been the facts, if the Chachamim did not want it recited anywhere else, there must have been a reason why they felt that it was important to have it recited in the Beis HaMikdash. And I think it's to emphasize that the Beis HaMikdash, that the temple, was the perpetuation of Matan Torah. It was the continuation of Matan Torah. The Beis HaMikdash was the Har Sinai, the permanent Har Sinai. The Kedusha, the sanctity of Har Sinai, was limited in time. But the Kedusha of Sinai was transferred to the Beis HaMikdash. And this was the perpetuation of Mount Sinai. It was the perpetuation of the giving, the experience of the giving of the Torah. And and we could suggest that this is the reason that and the truth of the matter is, when you take a look at last week's Sedra, Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, he comes, according to our sages, he underwent conversion to Judaism. He went through the process of Gerus. And then by Yimi Machras, it was the next day, and our sages say the next day means the day after Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Mount Sinai. And Moshe Rabbeinu sat lishpot esam, to judge the people. The same word as the first week of this week's Sedra, Ve'ela HaMishpatim. And the people were standing by Moshe, each waiting for his turn, perhaps. Min haboker ad erev, from morning to evening. And Yisro was not happy with that situation. He felt that the people waiting to talk to Moshe, standing there all day, and Moshe Rabbeinu standing there to answer their questions, or sitting there to answer their questions, that Moshe would, that they would not be able to continue in this manner. Not Moshe and not the Jewish people. And because of this, Moshe Rabbeinu, Yisro suggested to Moshe that he make a court system. And the hard questions that the judges would not be able to adjudicate, those should be brought to Moshe. And Moshe had the consent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for it. Matter of fact, the name Yisro, the name Yeser, because to a certain degree he was responsible, or he played a role in the addition of another parsha in the Torah. So the question is, why is it that Moshe initially, before Yisro explained to him the problem, did not understand that himself? Why was he disposed to continue to deal with the problems of each and every Jew himself? Which was an almost impossible task. But he wanted to assume that task on his shoulders. And by assuming that task on his shoulders, he would, in a sense, limit his abilities in other areas of leadership. And I think the reason is, and in a sense, Moshe Rabbeinu says it to Yisro. He says, when the people came to him, Vayomer Moshe l'chosno, when Yisro made his claim, when he tried to convince Moshe to change the way he deals with the halachic problems that come up, Vayomer Mish l'choso, ki yovo ailai ha'am lidrosh elokim. They are not coming to see me, but through me, they are coming, in a sense, lidrosh elokim, to get guidance from God himself. What is the idea? The idea is, Moshe Rabbeinu said, when it comes to adjudicating a question of Jewish law, when it comes to paskening a shaila, it's not the rabbi, the teacher, the judge, not even the Navi, who decides the Jewish law. It's lidrosh elokim. We evaluate, what did God say on the basis of the Torah? Of course, in later generations, we say lo b'shamayim. So it's done through learning, through Torah. But it's not what I want. It's not what I say, but what I think HaKadosh Baruch Hu said. I have to rise above myself in order to adjudicate a law. And it's lidrosh elokim, in a sense, Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, It has to be a perpetuation of Sinai. Lidro Shesalkim, when they stood at Sinai, it's true, the last commandments were given through Moshe's mouth. But they heard only the first two commandments from the voice of God. But it has to be that they have to sense, to a certain degree, the presence of God. They have to sense that the law is not Moshe Rabbeinu's law. It's not the rabbi who makes the law or determines the law. It's the rabbi who evaluates through the Torah what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said. And they have to see it as a Sinai experience. And Moshe Rabbeinu felt that the best way for them to see it as a Sinai, as a perpetuation of the Sinai experience, would be for him, for them to come in contact with him, because he's the one that brought down the law, that was the melitz in a certain sense between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. And it's very interesting that we could say, the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim says that the Jew, whoever believes in Moshe Rabbeinu v'Toraso, whoever believes in Moshe Rabbeinu and the Torah that he brought down from Sinai, has to rely, this is the expression of the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim, has to rely on the Psak of Bezdin HaGadol, has to rely on the decision of Bezdin HaGadol, of the High Court of Israel. When we rely on the decision of the High Court of Israel, he connects it with the idea of Mammon believing in Moshe and the Torah he brought down. Why is it that way? In other words, in a sense, we have to see, and there is a halacha, there is a law, that Moshe Kishim V'chad Koi, Moshe Rabbeinu had a din, had a law, had the status of Bezdin HaGadol. And one could raise a chakira, if I could use that word. Is the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu was considered like Bezdin HaGadol, like the High Court of Israel? Or we could say even more than that the High Court of Israel that came after Moshe Rabbeinu, according to some, it came toward the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, that the High Court of Israel was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, had the status to a certain degree, not chas v'shalom, in all areas, had the status of Moshe Rabbeinu, because we have to see the psak of Bezdin HaGadol as if it was given, as if it was the Torah that was delivered by Moshe Rabbeinu at Mount Sinai. And I think with this we could explain the Rashi in Mishpatim. In other words, the Jew who comes to Bezdin HaGadol, where there is a case, a question of Jewish law, or other batei dinim, other courts that come to evaluate, to seek guidance, to get direction from Bezdin HaGadol as to what the law is and what the law is. Their attitude has to be They're not coming to ask Bezdin Hagadol what the law should be. They're coming to ask Bezdin Hagadol what was the law that God commanded. In a sense, they have to see themselves as getting guidance from Moshe Rabbeinu as he was coming down from Mount Sinai. They have to feel when they're coming to the Bezdin Hagadol, not chas v'shalom, that the Bezdin Hagadol is in place, chas v'shalom v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but that the Bezdin Hagadol, in a sense, in a limited sense, was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu in giving over the halacha. And in a sense, they have to feel that closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that the Jewish people felt at Mount Sinai. The experience, my father would talk about I remember when my grandmother passed away at the Levaya, my father and my uncle, well, they both gave us Spadim, but there was one point that they both made, but they expressed it differently. My uncle said that from my grandfather, he got the Torah of Sinai. But from my grandmother, he got the Kolos Ubrakim of Har Sinai. Now, I knew my grandmother very well. Grandma was a very soft-spoken person, but she was a person that expressed the feelings and the emotions of Torah. And my father said that from my grandfather, he heard the voice of Sinai. From my grandmother, he had the experience of Sinai. Whether it's the Kolos Ubrakim of Sinai or the experience of Sinai, what is it? Neither of them explained, but I think the experience of Sinai and the Kolos Ubrakim of Sinai, that was the sensing of the closeness to the Shekhinah. Sensing of the closeness of the Shekhinah. And that's the reason why Bezdin Hagadol had to sit in the Lishkas HaGazis in the Beis HaMikdash, because the Beis HaMikdash was in place of Sinai. And to a certain degree, it supplied the experience of Sinai. And in the Beis HaMikdash, there was the Aron, which had the Luchos. It also had the Sefer Torah. And also, it also had the Beis HaMikdash had the Bezdin Hagadol. It had the Torah Shebechsav. It had the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition, the written tradition. Just as the Jewish people at Sinai received the written tradition, they received the oral tradition. It was all in order to emphasize that the psak of Bezdin Hagadol, the decisions of Bezdin Hagadol, should be seen as Torah that was given at Sinai by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, it's interesting that now it's interesting, the Rashi, and this is the connection ma'elu misinai after elu misinai. Of course, it was that the whole Torah was given at Sinai, but the idea is that the Sinai experience continued, and And Beis Din Hagadol also represented the perpetuation of the Sinai experience. Now, it's interesting also that the next Rashi in Mishpatim says, Asher Tosim Lefnehem. So Rashi says that if you know that a non-Jewish court will give the same law, the same decision as the Jewish court, you go to the Jewish court anyway. And the Rambam says that this is because if you don't do that, it's Merim Yad Neked Torah's Moshe. You're raising a hand against the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. What's the idea? Of course, we're talking with Batei Dinim, but the answer is we're talking about Batei Dinim who are dedicated. Of course, they didn't sit in the Lishkas HaGozis, but to a certain degree, every Beis Din is required to see itself as perpetuating the Sinai experience. They have to understand that the law is not theirs, that the law is God's law. And the psak is the decision of the court is the decision of the court. It's not just teaching. It's not just deciding. It's not just adjudicating. It's teaching Torah. It's the perpetuation of Torah. At Sinai, the Jewish people were told halachas laws that didn't apply at that point. But at Sinai, the Jewish people were taught the Torah. And the Beis Din Hagadol, when they paskin the Shaila, it wasn't just a psak, a decision. It was teaching Torah. It was the perpetuation of the giving of the Torah. And to a degree, every Beis Din has to do that. It has to perpetuate the Torah. It's not just to decide. And Rashi, a matter of fact, Rashi says, it's not enough to tell them the decision. You have to teach them why it is. Because it's not just a question, there's a conflict. There is a doubt. And we have to resolve the problem. No, it's the perpetuation of the giving, the perpetuation of the giving of the Torah. And it's interesting. The Gemara, the Torah in Parshas Shoftim, after discussing the mitzvah of appointing judges, says, Lo sita lecha ashera eitzel mizbach Hashem Elokecha. Do not plant an ashera. An ashera was an avodah zarah tree near the altar of God. Not allowed to have trees in the Har Bayis, but the Asherah was an avodah zarah tree. It was a tree that was either worshipped or that was planted outside the temples of the idolatrous religions. And the Torah tells us that you should not plant an Asherah. And Rashi cites the Sifri. Why does it next to the laws of appointing shoftim, appointing judges? Does it say Lo sita lecha Asherah eitzel mizbach Hashem Elokecha? So Rashi says, because if somebody appoints a dayan she'eino hagun, an improper judge, So it's Ki'ilu, it's like he planted an Asherah, an Avodah Zarah tree. And if he does it in a place where there is a Talmud Chacham, it's like Eitzel Mizbach Hashem Elokecha. It's like near the altar of God. Now, what's the analogy between an Asherah tree and a Dayan Sheina Hagan? Reb Chaim, it was probably expressive of the events that were taking place. I think I mentioned this in Parshas Shoftim. That was expressive of the things that took place that were taking place in Reb Chaim's time. At that time, they were appointing Dayanim, judges, who ain't a Hagun, who were not proper. And Reb Chaim said, an Asherah tree looks like a regular tree. But we know it's an Asherah tree. But in terms of, if you look at it, it looks the exact same thing. Same thing is, he says, they appoint someone as a dayan, as a judge, and he puts on a kapota. So he looks like any other judge. But you know that he isn't like any other judge. He isn't, when I say like any other judge. Unfortunately, today, it's become like any other judge, like Cook County judges. But we know that he doesn't see himself as perpetuating the study of Torah. He's making decisions based on who he could benefit from most. But I wanted to say just another explanation. How is it possible? Reb Chaim is right. We know. Very often we make believe that we don't know. But why is it that Dayan Sheina Hagan is able to go on? Because they turn him into an Avodah Zarah. They turn him into idolatry. You can't question it. When you have something that's just psak, that's Dayan Sheina Hagan. You want a Dayan Hagan, he has to be able to explain everything, the reasons for it. He has to be able to medama milsa to compare one situation to the other situation. You know, you can't just take an Igros Moshe. You learn the first paragraph, and then 5 pages later, you look at the last paragraph, and you have psak already. No. You have to go through the whole psak to see, because there are situations where it doesn't apply. You have to know the reason for the psak. So this is why, because the Beis Din Hagadol is a perpetuation of Matan Torah. Matan Torah wasn't just laws; it was Torah. Torah Shebaksav and Torah Shebal Peh. It was the thinking of Torah also, the understanding of Torah. I once heard that there was once a meeting. I don't know if the story is true. It was just told over to me. But the idea behind it is true. There was a meeting of a number of Rosh Yeshivas and Rabbanim. And one person got up and he said, "This is Das Torah." And Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zatzal, was at the meeting. He said, if you have a raya from a shach or a taz, then it might be Das Torah. But if it's just something that you're saying, it's your das. And that's the problem. The problem today is that psak is separated from lumdus, from havana, from understanding. Psak is not seen, it's just Gzeirahi milfanai. If it be the Gzeira v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's one thing. But Gzeirahi milfanai, it's the judge's decision. It's not Lidrosh Elokim. But to find out what the judge says, then that's not a perpetuation of Matan Torah. And it has to be a perpetuation of Matan Torah. You know, I saw and I think that this perhaps could be the explanation to the questions that I asked. What is the connection between the Mikdash? We said, if it's in a place where there's a Talmud Chacham, and they apply a point, a dayin sheina hagun, it's like planting an asherah on Mizbach Hashem Elokecha. What's the connection? The answer is the Mizbeach, we gave karbanos. The word karban, I think the Ramban says, comes from the word karov, coming close to God. The true Talmud Chacham, he perpetuates the Sinai experience. He understands that it's not his law. He doesn't make deals when it comes to paskening. He senses that when they come, they're coming to find out, or they should be coming to find out, what is the halacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Mizbeach represents the idea of carbon, of coming close. If you make a dayin sheina hagun, it's like an avodah zarah eitzel Mizbach Hashem Elokecha, because it has to be the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And I think that this, to a certain degree, is the connection between everything that took place. Why did Amalek attack? Amalek attacked the Jewish people because they said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin. Is God in our midst or not? And then Moshe Rabbeinu, after the war of Amalek, Moshe Rabbeinu built a Mizbeach. And in the Mizbeach, he built, and he says, Hashem Nisi. What's the idea of Mizbeach? When they call it God is my miracle. But Mizbeach means the Jewish people felt that God was not close to them. Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu imayin. But the Mizbeach, as I mentioned last week, it's not enough for God to reveal himself. We have to be sensitive to the presence of God. The Mizbeach represents the idea of carbon, of coming close to God. That was the answer. And then Yisro comes, and Moshe is perpetuating the idea of Matan Torah. And Yisro tells him this won't be able to continue. But of course, it has to be still based on the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu will tell the judges what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said. And Parshas Mishpatim, of course, then you have Matan Torah. And the idea that Bezdin Hagadol has to sit in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishkan is the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And of course, the unfortunate event of the Egel. Why did the Egel take place? How is it that the Jewish people, 40 days after saying Na'aseh v'Nishma, 40 days after being on a level higher than the Malachim, were able to stand in front of a golden calf and say, Elu Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. Chas v'shalom, how can we understand it? But the answer is, the Jewish people at the time of Matan Torah, they understood that they have to perpetuate the Torah. But the perpetuation of Torah can only be successful if you perpetuate the experience of Sinai also, not just the Torah of Sinai. But if you don't perpetuate the experience of Sinai, and the experience of Sinai is sensing the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you have the ostrich approach. The ostrich makes believe he doesn't see what's happening. It's easy for us to make believe that we don't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu there. And once we don't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu there, once we forget the Shavisi Hashem Lenegdi Samid, it's very easy to sin. The vidui, the nusach of vidui is, Ana Hashem, please God, Chatasi avisi pashati lefanecha, I sinned before you. Why is it important to say lefanecha, I sinned before you? Just say I sinned. But I think the Jew has to admit how he came to sin. It's not enough to say I sinned. How'd you come to sin? I made believe that you weren't there. God, now I realize that when I sinned, I fooled myself. You were really there. And that's what we have to understand. The perpetuation of Matan Torah has to be there when we paskin shailas. The perpetuation of Matan Torah has to be there when we daven. Perpetuation of Matan Torah has to be wherever we are. But we have to remember, we can only perpetuate Matan Torah, both the Torah of Sinai, if we perpetuate also the experience of Sinai. And the Beis HaMikdash was an aid. It was in place of Mount Sinai. And Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, you shall serve me in this place. So Har Sinai was the place of Avodah. It was the place of Torah Shebeksav. It was the place of Torah Shebal Peh. Bezdin Hagadol is the Amud Torah Shebal Peh. It's the pillar of the oral tradition. It was Mount Sinai. So Bezdin Hagadol had to sit in the Beis HaMikdash. But even though we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we do not have the authority of the Bezdin Hagadol, even though there are those that seem to claim that they do. We don't have the authority of Bezdin Hagadol. But we have to try our best to perpetuate Matan Torah, to understand that when it comes to Torah, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah. It's not our Torah in the sense that we can say what the Torah should say. We have to say what the Torah does say. All right.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Anyone have any questions? Guess was pretty clear.
Okay.
Okay, so if the Sanhedrin has to be in the Beis Hamikdash, how did they keep their authority after the Churban in places like Yavna?
So they did not have the Rambam and the Ramban is very clear, and even from the Rambam it appears that to a certain degree, their status was much lower. One question I didn't answer. Now I remember. The question is two psukim. Why is there two psukim in to tell me the halacha? The reason is because there are two reasons why there should be a place for the Beis Din Hagadol. One is because of the Mikdash. The Mikdash has to be in place of Mount Sinai. And for the Beis Hamikdash to be in place of Mount Sinai, it needs a place for the Beis Din Hagadol that's in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And also, it was a din. It was also a din in the Beis Din Hagadol. The Beis Din Hagadol has to be in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, and it has to be the perpetuation of the giving of the Torah. So they have to be in the Beis Hamikdash, which is the perpetuation of Sinai. So we have two psukim because one is a law in Beis Din Hagadol, the other is a law in the Beis Hamikdash.
Is there any connection here to the 4 Parshios?
Any connection to the 4 Parshios? Yes. Parshas HaChodesh, there's a big connection, but it will require a whole share because the Rambam says that the Kiddush HaChodesh is dependent upon Beis Din Hagadol, and the Rambam says if Kiddush HaChodesh is dependent upon the existence of Beis Din Hagadol, how is it they were Makadosh the Chodesh by the sighting of the moon for so many years after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? And Beis Din Hagadol loses its status as Beis Din Hagadol after the Churban. But that's for another time. That's the Ramban's question against the Rambam.
Daniel wants to know, what do you say to those who say it's heresy not to believe in Das Torah?
It's a free country.
And then someone wants your opinion on the Israeli law that people are allowed to bring chametz into the hospital on Pesach.
Well, all right. Obviously, you shouldn't be allowed to bring chametz unless it's necessary for sakonas nefashos purposes. You know, that's if it's for sakonas nefashos. I don't know anything about the question, and I don't know about that situation in particular. But if it's necessary for sakonas nefashos, of course you're allowed to do it. You know. It's I guess everybody admits it's not like going to a wedding where there you put yourself in danger. But
if you put a mask on the chametz, it's okay to bring it into the hospital.
Well, at least if it covers the mouth, you don't have to worry about the prohibition of eating chametz. Okay.
Okay. Is a psak halacha das Torah?
I'm not sure what Das Torah is. I can't tell you. If the psak halacha is a psak based on an evaluation of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said at Sinai, then it's Das Torah. But if it's just something that somebody said, it's nothing. But you know, there could be a machlokes. Again, I don't know what the word Das Torah is. It's something that came up in that concept was something that came up in I think at the time of the argument in Germany about separating the Orthodox Kehillah from the conservative and Reform Kehillah. So that's where that concept of those words originated, but to say, but but I'm not sure how the terminology is used, so I can't answer that question.
Hey, thank you very much. That's all that's in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll, God willing, see you next.